we can see all of this stuff around that is getting its energy from the sun. And remember that those would be our very first trophic level, called our producers. And the stuff that feeds on that is our consumers. But we're going to think about separating out types of consumers based on the order of which they eat, what they feed upon. Because remember, the whole objective of eating is to provide energy. So by talking about eating relationships, we're also talking about energy relationships. And by flow of food, we're also talking about flows of energy. So the producers are providing energy to the primary or the first consumers. So think about what things are going to be eating these producers. So those would be our primary consumers. So those things are going to be, since they're eating the producers, they're going to be our herbivores. So those are our primary consumers. But then we're going to have secondary consumers that feed upon the primary consumers. So think about what sorts of things, what characteristics would that have? So if we think about having our producers, our primary consumers, which are eating those, and then our secondary consumers, which are eating the primary consumers, each of those things is called a trophic level. So each of those is gaining its energy from what the previous trophic level was. So if our primary consumers are our herbivores, our secondary consumers eat both the plants and some animals. But let's think about in terms of what size they would be. Do you think secondary consumers are going to be really, really big? Or do you think they're going to be really small? If they're omnivores, so they're going to eat both plants and some other meat. But remember, meat can be insects too. So then what feeds upon the secondary consumers is called our tertiary consumers. So those guys are strictly carnivores. So those eat the secondary consumers. And we can also have quaternary or fourth level consumers, which are also carnivores. So think about what's going to happen to the size of every consumer as we increase in a trophic level, in knowing that it's getting its energy from what it eats. So every trophic level is getting energy from what it eats from before that. And remember that originally this energy is all coming from the sun. And a rule of thumb is called the 10% rule, where only 10% of that energy is actually taken in by the organism, and 90% of it is lost as heat, like how you guys actually lose heat. So do dogs and monkeys and bees and snakes. They lose 90% of their energy to the environment. It's not actually used as in order to do work. So take a look at this environment that I'm in again. And it doesn't just stop with our quaternary or our tertiary consumers. Then we have something called an apex predator. And that's the very top of our food web. And those are things that don't have anything that eats them. So let's go back and review here and think about what our producers would be. So our producers are going to be all of these plants. Our primary consumers are going to be the bugs that eat these plants. Our secondary consumers are going to be some of the insects that both eat plants and that eat those smaller things. And especially in an environment like this, we can have things like algae that are our producers. And then we can have organisms in the water that are not single-celled organisms, that are multicellular, but that are eating on the single-celled organisms. And those would be our primary consumers. So then we have our secondary consumers, which are our omnivores. And then we have our tertiary consumers, which are eating those things. So now we think about our organisms. So we went from just small, simple organisms like our bugs, to then our bigger insects and maybe some small rodents, to then things that feed upon those, maybe our snakes. And then we're adding to that to bigger predators, and ultimately, in an environment like this, our apex predators like bears. Things that don't have anything that feeds on top of that. And I want you to think about the numbers of insects versus bears. And that goes into our 10% rule. So as as we already talked about, trophic levels are defined by feeding relationships and changes of energy throughout a system. But not all energy that is consumed by one organism gets transferred to another organism. It's actually only 10%. So to illustrate that, I have a bunch of rocks here. So if we think about a producer is getting this much energy from the sun, this is 100% of the energy from the sun that a producer or a plant takes in. Remember, that's our first trophic level. That's the bottom of the food chain. So from this, only 10% gets transferred to the next trophic level, which is our primary consumers. So this rock is about 10% of that size. So of all of this energy, only 10% of it gets transferred to the primary consumers. So next we have, our very small insects, our herbivores. They get this much energy. So now this is 100% of their energy, but only 10% of this energy gets transferred to the secondary consumers, or the next in the trophic level. So I think that this rock is about 10% of that size. So now our secondary consumers only get 10% of the primary consumer's original energy. So now we have only this. So this is, remember, 10% from the previous trophic level, which was 10% of that trophic level. So every time, only 10% is being transferred. So now if we think about our tertiary or even our apex predators, only 10% of this energy, or something about this size, gets transferred. So think about, is it possible for an ecosystem to have thousands of apex predators? Or can this food chain continue on indefinitely? Is there enough energy to go around? If we started with this much and we ended with this much, so this ends up being 1,000th of what the producers started with. So this explains why we see food pyramids, because eventually there isn't enough energy to go around.